Welcome everyone. Now we're going to look again at the article that we looked at last time, and we're going to continue with this. So remember last time we went over Trent Horn's argument, and then we kind of started with Ellis's argument, but then I had to go to work. Alright, so here we are late at night. I got a little headache. I just took some Tylenol. Hopefully it'll help. I got pulled up the argument that we were forming of Ellis's right here on Notepad. So we're going to try and see if we can look at this a little more carefully. So let me go back up. This is the paragraph we were looking at. So this is where Ellis talks about her main argument, and we were holding that her position is not necessarily that abortion should be, that it's immoral, but rather her position seems to be that it should be legal. That's what she's arguing for, the legality of abortion. Okay. And remember, we were going over this, and her main argument seems to be, she's talking about how if abortion is made illegal, it's going to have negative effects on the marginalized. Rich white women are going to benefit, and people who are marginalized are going to not benefit. So I think, if I pull back up the argument, this is sort of the argument we formed. We want to go over it again. If the forbidding by law of a currently permitted act will result in a disproportionate negative effect on the marginalized, then the act should not be forbidden by law. Forbidding by law of abortion will result in a disproportionate negative effect on the marginalized, therefore abortion should not be forbidden by law. This is her main argument. And I want to draw attention to something called utilitarianism. And this is a philosophy of morality that has to do with well-being and ill-being. So here's the way utilitarianism works. For any sort of action, and you want to question the morality of it, what you have to do is you have to look into the future, and you have to see what type of positive and negative effects come out of it as a result of it. And you say, well, and you judge this in terms of well-being and ill-being. Well-being is, if you think of people, we're well, we're happy, safe, healthy. That'd be well-being. Ill-being would be, you're unhappy, unhealthy, things like that. People aren't doing well. So basically, it's sort of mathematical in a way, utilitarianism. To judge whether something is moral, you just look at the overall amount of well-being and ill-being that you expect is going to result from the act. And then, if the alternative option is worse, that is, it has more ill-being and less well-being as a result, then the original option is better. So I think she's arguing in this way. Hopefully I described that somewhat well. It's not a philosophy I'm a fan of, because when it comes to utilitarianism, if you're a hardcore utilitarian, you can come up with all sorts of situations, hypothetical situations, where to do what is seemingly morally horrible will result maybe in a lot of well-being and very little ill-being retrospectively, in terms of you have to encompass the whole future, okay, and you have to encompass all people when you do utilitarian assessments. So you can't just, it's very broad. It goes to the bounds of the universe in time and encompasses all people. So you get into weird situations where it's like, oh, you can come up with these hypotheticals. They'll do them in philosophy class. It's like, oh, you could murder this person if you know all this good stuff is going to come about as a result of murdering this person. Should you do it? And the utilitarian will have to say, oh yeah, because it's going to result in all this great well-being, and the alternative to not murder that person will not merit the same positive well-being relative to the ill-being that will result. So I talk about all that because her argument seems to be very utilitarian here. If you look at premise 1 here, basically saying something should not be made illegal if the making of it illegal is going to have an overall negative effect. And in this case, she's talking about the marginalized. Now, I don't think that's a strong premise. And here's why. It's making the case that it's making the utilitarian case for morality. Basically, it's saying what should be done is that which will result in well-being, rather than what should be done is based on some sort of other moral criteria, if that makes sense. So let's suppose, for example, so I'm having trouble coming up with some sort of hypothetical here that doesn't sound ridiculous. Like I was thinking, like, let's imagine that currently murder is illegal. Okay, I don't think it should be legal because murder is wrong. What makes it wrong? You're taking an innocent life. It's part of the natural law. Suppose that there's a debate going on in Congress whether murder should be made illegal. Suppose, though, that murder being made illegal might have a negative effect, disproportionate negative effect on the marginalized. Why is that? Well, it could be that the marginalized, because of the condition they grow up in, economic situation, and all of that, they are more likely to maybe there's more likely to be murders in the areas where people are more marginalized because of that. And someone could argue, well, it's going to have a disproportionate negative effect on the marginalized. The rich white women, they're not going around murdering, right? Therefore, murder should not be illegal. It should be legal. But we know that's wrong, right? The reason murder should be illegal is just because it's wrong. And even if making murder illegal does disproportionately affect the marginalized, it shouldn't be allowed. So that is sort of my wild example, I guess. I'm having trouble figuring out what her argument is for why abortion will result in a disproportionate negative effect on the marginalized. So there's two main parts to this argument. One is the disproportionate part. One is the negative effect part. Because the only negative effect that she seems to... let's try to see. I want to represent the argument well. It just says making abortion illegal is going to disproportionately affect them. But it doesn't say how it's going to affect them. And it's evident here that it's implied that this effect that she's talking about is a negative effect. So here's how I imagine it. If abortion is illegal, the only effect it would have on people is to forbid them from having an abortion, right? Okay. So that's the only effect it will have. Is that a negative effect? The implication she has seems to be that it's a negative thing for them to not be allowed to have an abortion. This is an underlying assumption here. When we say, when in her argument, this negative effect here, what is the negative effect? The negative effect is unable to have abortion. Okay. Others will disagree and say, no, that's a positive effect. Right? Is that really even a negative effect? So, a whole separate argument would have to be made for why that is a negative effect. The only reason it would be a negative effect would be if abortion is morally permissible, right? If abortion was really something that should be permitted, if it was a human right, then sure, being unable to have one, being forbidden to have one by law, would be a negative effect. And I could be convinced it might disproportionately affect the marginalized. Sure, maybe they're more likely to get into such a pregnancy, or whatever the case may be, or maybe, yeah. But the argument has to precede it that abortion is morally permissible in order for this to be a negative effect. Because if abortion is morally impermissible, how would the inability to have one be a negative effect? That should be a positive effect, because it would reduce the possibility for something morally impermissible from occurring, right? So I don't think she makes a solid argument. I mean, if it's in here, I would like to find it. But the argument for why it's going to disproportionately affect, I mean, even if we take out the word negative, okay, let's just say disproportionately affect. Okay, but it would only make sense that it's bad if it's affecting them in a negative way, right? Like, you might say when the Civil Rights Act came to be, when all the segregated, all the separate water fountains and everything, when that ended, you could say it had a disproportionate effect on the marginalized, right? In a good way, though. Like, the people who are, the white people had, they didn't really worry about it much. They had probably the nicer bathrooms, the nicer water fountains. So it was, for those people who were marginalized and treated so poorly, it had a disproportionate effect on them in a good way. So just because something has a disproportionate effect doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It might be that those who are disproportionately affected needed to be affected more. If that makes any sense. But I think she's implying here that it's going to disproportionately affect them in a bad way. And I don't see the argument. I don't see how. Unless she's convinced that abortion is like a human right or whatever. But she says up here she would love to see a world with less abortion, so I'm not quite understanding her position in this regard. Now, I actually want to go on a little bit more. She says, these are the kind of people that Jesus was always advocating for in his life and ministry. I don't know if that's really an argument for why it should be legal. It's a little bit of a... I'm trying to... You can interpret this in so many ways. It's... Yes, did Jesus try to help the marginalized? Absolutely. I mean, he went to those who were downtrodden, okay. He did not that does not necessarily mean that he approved of everything they did or approved of anything that they could do. Like, very often Jesus would go to these people, the lowest of the low in society, and he would heal them, but then what would he say to them? He'd say, stop sinning. So he didn't say to them, well, because you're marginalized and so lowly, whatever you do is permissible. No. I know she's not making that argument necessarily either, but there's not really much of an argument in this sentence unless you really expand it out and explain more thoroughly what's being talked about. Okay, and the last sentence here says, I first and foremost am always going to side with a living, breathing human woman and what's best for her and her family situation. Okay. So this might be giving some more agency or more moral agency to someone who's out of the womb than in the womb. That's the underlying thing here. Because it says what's best for her and her family situation. In a way, this would have to do one of two things probably. Either leave the child in the womb, sort of exclude that child from being in the family, or sort of put that child at a lesser threshold of moral relevance. That's how I'm seeing that. So, do I want to try and expand this argument out any more in premise conclusion format? With this headache, I don't know. I don't know how much I can, because I stated the whole argument here that's disproportionately going to affect the marginalized. We'll just need a whole separate argument for why that's a bad thing in the first place, or why it's disproportionately affecting them in a negative way. Okay, I'm going to try a little harder and do some more premise conclusion stuff, because that's what we all probably want to see, right? Alright. I'm looking back at this second to last sentence here where it says, these are the kind of people that Jesus was always advocating for in his life and ministry. I think that seems to be an argument for why anything having a disproportionate negative effect on the marginalized should. Okay, I think that's an argument for premise one, basically, was what I'm saying. So we could almost see what I highlight here on the marginalized? We can take premise one and copy it. Let's do this. I'm going to call this premise 0. And basically what I'm going to do, on those Jesus paid is special. Alright, this premise 0, I'm just going to call this premise 0.5. Sure. Alright, okay, maybe we'll call this premise -1. Let me just renumber all these. This is... Alright, that's 3, that's 4. Alright, so we just expanded this argument. So the goal was to try to make premise 3, which was formerly premise 1, a little more robust, okay? But I don't think, here's the thing. You don't need the fact that Jesus cared for the marginalized to make it the fact that the marginalized should be cared for. You know, we don't care for the marginalized just because Jesus did. It's just because it's naturally right to do so. Right? I don't think it's that necessary. I don't think it makes it really any stronger. Well, honestly, I think that's all I have in me right now. I want to come back to this article. I ain't done with it yet. But I still got this headache. The Tylenol didn't work. That's okay. I'm grateful for whatever. But I hopefully you learned a little something. That she's arguing from a utilitarian point of view. And if you really dig into utilitarianism, you'll find it does not work. I'll say that. Alright, thank you everyone for watching this. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, morning, whatever time it is for you.